The rain poured heavily as Daniel rushed through the empty streets, his hood barely shielding him from the icy droplets. The night air was thick with the scent of wet pavement, and a strange fog crept along the ground, swirling around his feet as he hurried home. But then, out of nowhere, he saw it, a bookstore he had never noticed before. It stood wedged between two abandoned buildings, its wooden sign creaking in the wind. The words "Blackwood's Rare Tomes" were carved into the weathered surface, barely legible under the dim glow of an old-fashioned lantern hanging above the entrance. He had walked this path 100 times, but this shop had never been here before. Curiosity gnawed at him. The windows were dark, the glass fogged with condensation, but he could faintly make out the towering shelves inside. Something about the place felt off. But before he could talk himself out of it, a gust of wind pushed against his back, almost as if urging him inside. The bell above the door let out a shrill chime as he stepped in. The air inside was thick with the scent of aged paper and ink, mixed with something else, something metallic like rust. Or was it blood? The dim lighting flickered, casting long, distorted shadows across the wooden floor. Shelves stretched high, crammed with books that looked far older than the store itself. Some covers were wrapped in cracked leather, others in what looked like stitched flesh. An old man sat behind the counter, hunched over a massive tome. His long, bony fingers turned the pages with deliberate slowness, as if savoring each word. His face was gaunt, pale, his sunken eyes lifting only when Daniel took a hesitant step forward. "You seek knowledge, don't you?" the old man rasped, his voice like dried leaves scraping against stone. Daniel hesitated. I was just..." The old man smiled, revealing teeth too sharp, too uneven. "I have something for you," he whispered. His hand slid beneath the counter and emerged with a book wrapped in dark, worn leather. The edges of the pages were stained a deep brown, too dark to be age alone. The cover had no title, no markings. Just the unsettling sensation that it was waiting for someone. Daniel swallowed hard, his throat suddenly dry. "What is it?" The old man's smile widened. "It's special. It writes what's inside your mind. Your deepest thoughts. Your darkest fears." Something in Daniel's chest tightened. He should have left. He should have turned around and walked out. But instead, his hands reached for the book before he could stop himself. The moment his fingers touched the cover, a shiver ran down his spine. The leather felt warm, like it was alive. The lights flickered violently, and for a split second, Daniel swore he heard a whisper, his own name, slithering from the pages. And then, the book opened on its own. Daniel's breath hitched as the book's pages flipped on their own, faster than the wind should allow. The whispers grew louder, slithering through the dimly lit bookstore like unseen serpents. The old man behind the counter watched with an eerie calmness, his hollow eyes reflecting the dim candlelight. Daniel wanted to close the book, but something wouldn't let him. His hands trembled as he looked down. The pages had stopped turning, settling on a blank sheet. For a moment, it seemed normal, just old, yellowed paper. But then the ink began to move. At first, it was just a small blot of darkness forming at the center of the page, like spilled ink. But it didn't stay still. It spread, shifting, curling, twisting, as if something beneath the paper was clawing its way out. Slowly, words began to take shape. "What do you fear the most, Daniel?" Daniel's heart pounded in his chest. His mouth was dry, his body frozen. He hadn't spoken his name. He hadn't written anything. Yet the book knew. His fingers twitched as he flipped the page, but the moment he did, new words appeared, scrawled in jagged, unnatural handwriting. "Don't try to run. The book is watching." Daniel's hands jerked away from the book as if it had burned him. The old man chuckled, the sound raspy and hollow. "Fascinating, isn't it?" he murmured. Daniel took a step back, every instinct screaming at him to get out. But something about the book rooted him in place. He had never believed in the supernatural, never entertained the idea of cursed objects or haunted books. But this was wrong. I don't want this," Daniel stammered, forcing himself to step away from the counter. The old man's smile never wavered. "It's already yours." Daniel's head snapped back to the book, His name was still there, inked across the page like a brand, like a curse. He slammed the book shut and turned to leave, but as he reached for the door, it wouldn't budge. The knob wouldn't turn. The windows were completely black now, as if the world outside had vanished. His breathing grew uneven. He was trapped. Slowly, his gaze drifted back to the book. The cover had changed. His own name was now etched into the leather, the ink still fresh, still wet. Daniel Carter. Beneath it, in that same twisted handwriting, another sentence formed. The story has begun, and you cannot escape. The lights flickered. The whispering voices grew louder. And behind him, the old man began to laugh. Daniel's chest tightened as the laughter echoed through the bookstore, crawling under his skin like writhing insects. The old man's voice was dry, brittle, like a throat filled with dust and decay. The book still sat on the counter, pulsing as if it had a heartbeat of its own. The words on the cover were no longer still. They were shifting. His name twisted and distorted, melting into something unrecognizable before reforming again. Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter. Daniel Carter. Each repetition felt like a whisper spoken directly into his mind. He took a step back, pressing himself against the locked door. His fingers trembled as he tried the handle again. It wouldn't move. The wood was ice-cold beneath his palm, as if it had been frozen over. A sharp scratching sound made him whip around. The book was writing something again. Daniel watched in horror as the ink bled across the page, crawling like a living thing. It wasn't written by a pen. It was being carved in, like something was clawing its way through the paper. Slowly, the words formed. Look behind you. Daniel's throat tightened. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. No. No, I won't. But the air behind him grew heavy, dense, like a presence had manifested in the room. The fine hairs on his arms stood on end, and the temperature plummeted, his breath fogging in front of him. The whisper came next. Not from the book. Not from the old man. From right behind his ear. Turn around, Daniel. His body refused to obey. His instincts screamed for him to run, to fight, to do anything but stand frozen in fear. But his limbs felt like stone, heavy, immobile. Then, something brushed against his shoulder. His breath hitched. It wasn't a hand. It wasn't even solid. It was cold, damp, and breathing. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears as he squeezed his eyes shut. It's not real. It's not real. The old man chuckled from the counter. You should listen to the book. Daniel's hands clenched into fists. Every part of his being screamed, don't turn around, don't look. But something was moving behind him, shifting, whispering his name over and over again in a voice that sounded disturbingly familiar. His own. Then, the book's pages flipped violently, and new words appeared in thick, dripping ink. If you don't look, it will make you. The whisper behind him grew louder. The breathing became ragged, hungry. And before he could stop himself, before he could fight the unnatural force tightening around his neck, his head turned on its own. And what he saw made him wish he had never entered the bookstore. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as his head turned against his will. His muscles strained, but it was useless. Something far stronger controlled him now. His own reflection stood behind him. But it wasn't a reflection. It was him, yet twisted. The figure was identical. Same face, same clothes. But its skin was wrong, a sickly gray, as if the life had been drained from it. Its lips curled into a wide, unnatural grin, stretching too far, exposing blackened gums and jagged teeth. Its eyes were the worst part. Completely hollow, endless voids of darkness. It raised its hand, mirroring Daniel's movements perfectly. But Daniel hadn't moved. A suffocating dread filled his chest as the thing's head tilted unnaturally far to the side, the bones cracking like snapping twigs. Then, slowly, impossibly, it opened its mouth. A voice came out. I wrote you. Daniel stumbled back, slamming against the counter, his heartbeat deafening. The book flipped its pages wildly, as if possessed. Ink bled from the pages, pooling onto the floor, stretching toward him like grasping fingers. The creature took a step forward, its movements jerky wrong, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Daniel's vision blurred. This isn't real. It couldn't be. But the air was thick with the smell of damp ink and rotting paper. The whispers weren't in his head. They were in the room. The book trembled violently on the counter. The ink began forming words again, this time larger, bolder, dripping like fresh blood. Run. Daniel didn't hesitate. His feet moved before his mind could process it. He bolted past the thing that wore his face, shoving aside a shelf of books. They collapsed with a loud crash, sending torn pages flying through the air. He didn't look back. The bookstore was shifting around him. The walls stretched, darkened. The exit door was gone. Instead, in its place stood another mirror. Daniel skidded to a stop. He could see himself inside it. His real self. Wild-eyed. Terrified. And behind his reflection, something crawled out of the darkness. Long, spindly fingers reached from the void, wrapping around the edges of the mirror. Something was coming through. The whispers rose into a chorus of distorted laughter. Daniel turned, desperate for another way out, but the bookstore was gone. He was standing in an endless, empty void. The floor beneath him was nothing but pages, shifting like waves of an ocean made of ink. The book lay open at his feet, its final message staring back at him. You cannot wake up from a nightmare you wrote yourself. And then, the hands in the mirror grabbed him. Daniel screamed as the hands pulled him into the mirror. It wasn't glass, it was liquid, thick like tar. It swallowed him whole, dragging him into suffocating darkness. His limbs flailed, but there was nothing to hold on to, nothing to push against. Just the endless abyss. Then, with a violent jolt, he hit solid ground. Daniel gasped for air, his lungs burning. He was back inside the bookstore. But something was wrong. The shelves were still there, the old wooden counter, the dim lighting. But it was different. The air felt heavier, thicker, carrying the scent of damp paper and mildew. The bookshelves stretched impossibly high, their tops vanishing into darkness. And worst of all, every book was open, and every page was filled with his name. Hundreds of books. Thousands. All of them knew him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he approached one of the books. He reached out with trembling fingers and turned a page. The ink bled and twisted, shifting into his handwriting. Daniel Carter picked up the book, unaware that it was already writing his every move. Daniel's blood ran cold. He turned the page. He flipped to another page, searching for answers. But what he read next made his stomach drop. His hands trembled as he obeyed the words. He flipped to another page. The ink was still moving. The words were being written in real time. He realized too late that the book was not recording his past. It was writing his future. Daniel's heart pounded. He tore through the pages, his fingers shaking. His pulse slammed against his skull as he reached the final paragraph. And there, written in thick, inky blackness, was a sentence that made his breath stop. The book fell from his hands as something whispered his name from behind him. A sharp thud echoed through the room. The book had slipped from his fingers. And then the whisper came. Daniel. Ice crawled up his spine. His knees locked in place. It was the same voice as before, the voice that sounded exactly like his own. He clenched his jaw. No, not this time. Daniel turned around, his muscles coiled with tension. The bookstore was empty. No twisted doppelganger. No shadowy figures. Just rows upon rows of books, all of them watching him with their silent, unreadable pages. He exhaled shakily, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. Maybe he was losing his mind. Maybe. The bookshelves shifted. Daniel's stomach dropped as the shelves began to move, twisting, closing in around him like a living maze. The bookstore was rearranging itself. And somewhere, deep within the labyrinth of books, the whisper came again. I'm waiting. Daniel ran. The bookshelves twisted and shifted like writhing serpents, closing in around him, reshaping the store into a maze. The floor groaned beneath his feet, the wood splitting and warping like it was alive. No matter which direction he turned, the path behind him disappeared. The whisper had followed him into the labyrinth. You can't run from a story that's still being written. Daniel's breath came in ragged gasps. He turned a corner, only to see the books on the nearest shelf flipping open on their own. The pages rustled as if an invisible force was reading them. No, writing them. He stopped. His hands trembled as he stepped closer. The ink bled across the page, forming a new sentence. Daniel hesitated, unaware that something was standing directly behind him. The temperature dropped. His skin prickled. A breath, not his own, brushed against the back of his neck. He spun around. Nothing. Just the endless rows of bookshelves, stretching into the shadows. Daniel stumbled backward, his pulse hammering. He had to get out. Had to escape this nightmare before. The floor collapsed beneath him. With a sharp crack, the wooden planks splintered, and Daniel plummeted into darkness. He landed hard, the impact rattling his bones. A deep, suffocating silence surrounded him. No more bookshelves. No more whispers. Just the cold, unyielding void. For a moment, he thought he had finally escaped. Then he saw the book. It sat in the darkness, open, waiting. The pages glowed faintly, as if the words were alive. Slowly, unwillingly, Daniel crawled toward it. His fingers moved on their own, turning the page. A new passage had appeared, freshly written in dripping black ink. Daniel thought he had reached the bottom. But the story was far from over. He clenched his jaw. No. He grabbed the book, fingers digging into its cover. If this cursed thing was writing his life, he would end it. No. He tore the page in half. A piercing shriek filled the air. The ink bled like fresh wounds, spilling from the torn paper, pooling around him like living shadows. The darkness writhed, screaming, twisting into familiar shapes. Faces. His own face. Hundreds of them, all whispering in perfect unison. You can't escape what's already written. The shadows lunged. Daniel tried to scream, but the ink poured into his mouth, down his throat, choking him, drowning him in his own nightmare. The darkness swallowed him whole, pulling him deeper. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was a new page turning on its own. And there, in bold, final letters, the book wrote its next chapter. Daniel Carter disappeared into the story, never to be seen again. Darkness. A suffocating, ink-drenched void surrounded Daniel, pressing against his skin like a second layer of flesh. He wasn't just inside the book anymore. He was part of it. His body felt weightless, yet his mind was trapped in an unbearable heaviness. His thoughts blurred, tangled in whispers that weren't his own. Then, without warning, he fell. He crashed onto a cold, stone floor, gasping as the shadows retreated into the walls around him. He was no longer in the bookstore. Daniel pushed himself up, his breath ragged. A long, endless corridor stretched before him, lined with towering bookshelves. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of old paper and something else, something rotten. The books were different here. They weren't bound in leather or cloth. They were bound in flesh. Daniel's stomach twisted as he reached for one. The cover felt warm, pulsing beneath his fingers like it was alive. He hesitated, then slowly opened it. The pages weren't paper. They were skin. And scrawled across them, in ink so dark it looked like dried blood, was his name. Daniel Carter. Over and over. Entire pages filled with nothing but his name. His breath hitched. He turned another page. The ink twisted, shifting, forming new words. Daniel Carter flipped the page, unaware that something was watching him from the shadows. A cold shiver ran down his spine. Slowly, dreading what he would see, he looked up. At the end of the corridor, barely visible in the dim light, something stood between the bookshelves. Tall, unmoving. It had no face, only a shifting blur where its features should be. But the worst part, it held a book. And it was writing. The ink bled from its fingertips, scrawling fresh words onto the page. Daniel's heart slammed against his ribs as he took a step back, but before he could move any further, the book in his hands flipped to a new page. A new sentence appeared, ink forming before his eyes. He tried to run, but the book wouldn't let him leave. His fingers burned. The book, the cursed living book, was fusing to his hands. He screamed, trying to rip it away, but it was useless. The more he struggled, the tighter it clung. From the shadows, the faceless figure took a step forward. Daniel's breath hitched. Then another step. And another. The ink poured from its fingertips like dripping tar, forming words faster and faster. Daniel glanced down at his book. The final sentence on the page sent ice through his veins. The moment he looked up, the thing would no longer be far away. He squeezed his eyes shut. Footsteps. Right in front of him. A whisper, crawling into his ear. "Look at me." Daniel kept his eyes shut, heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst. He couldn't look. He wouldn't look. The thing stood right in front of him, its whisper slithering through his ears. "Look at me." Its voice was neither loud nor forceful, but it carried something worse. A sickly, compelling pull, like the words themselves had hooks, digging into his mind, tearing away his will. Daniel clenched his teeth. If he opened his eyes, it would be over. But then, the book in his hands turned another page. On its own. Ink bled into fresh parchment, shaping words he wished he'd never see. Daniel's curiosity got the best of him. Against his better judgment, his eyes slowly fluttered open. No. He squeezed his lids tighter, shaking his head violently. It was writing him into its story. The faceless figure stepped closer. He felt the air shift, the overwhelming stench of ink and decay pressing against his skin. The book turned another page. Even as he fought it, his body betrayed him. His eyelids twitched. A crack of vision slipped through. Daniel fought back a scream. His muscles were stiff, heavy, no longer his own. A burning sensation crawled beneath his eyelids, itching, tingling, forcing them to open. No. With a desperate grunt, he ran. Blind. He crashed into bookshelves, splinters cutting his arms, ancient books tumbling around him. The corridor stretched endlessly, an abyss of suffocating shadows. But he didn't stop. He couldn't. Behind him, the sound of pages turning. Faster. Ink-soaked whispers filled the air. The words of the book came to life, clawing at him, wrapping around his legs like tendrils of black smoke. Daniel stumbled but forced himself forward. He had to escape before the next page turned. His pulse pounded in his skull as his feet slammed against the cold floor. He wasn't just running from the thing. He was running from the story itself. But the book wasn't done. It turned another page. Daniel's breath caught as the ink formed fresh words in real time. No matter how fast he ran, he would never reach the exit. Because the exit did not exist. His legs gave out. He collapsed, the weight of the truth crushing him. The corridor stretched infinitely. Not a single door, not a single way out. And still, the whispers grew closer. The faceless figure had no need to chase him. The book had already written his fate. Tears burned his eyes as the next sentence appeared, each letter stabbing into his chest like a nail sealing his coffin. Daniel Carter would never escape. His story was already finished. From behind him, the voice whispered one last time. The end. Darkness swallowed him. Daniel's world went black. For a moment, he felt nothing. No ground beneath him, no air in his lungs. Just endless, suffocating emptiness. Then, with a violent gasp, he woke up. The corridor, the faceless figure, the endless bookshelves, all gone. He was back in his apartment. Daniel's body trembled as he pushed himself up from the floor. His hands ached, his head pounded, and his breath came in ragged gasps. The book, the cursed living book, was still in his grip. It lay open, pages fluttering as if caught in a phantom breeze. Ink moved on its own, forming words he refused to read. His mind screamed at him to get rid of it. Destroy it. Burn it. Daniel stumbled to his feet, nearly tripping over himself as he rushed toward the kitchen. Matches. He needed matches. He yanked open a drawer, fumbling until his fingers closed around a small box. His hands shook violently as he struck one, a tiny flame sparking to life. The book trembled. Daniel's stomach twisted. He could feel it now, an intelligence lurking inside. The ink pulsed, shifting like 1,000 tiny eyes staring at him from the pages. It knew what he was about to do. For the first time, words didn't appear in the book. It simply let out a sound. A whisper. Low. Fleeting. Don't. Daniel gritted his teeth, his skin crawling. He didn't care. This nightmare had to end. He dropped the match. Flames licked hungrily at the pages, curling them into blackened, shriveled husks. The ink bled out, sizzling as if screaming in agony. The book convulsed. The room shook. Every shadow in the apartment stretched toward him, twisting unnaturally. The air grew thick, suffocating. The fire roared higher, but something within the book was fighting back. Daniel staggered as the whispers turned to screams. "You think you've won?" The voice was no longer pleading. It was mocking, laughing. The book burst apart, sending ashes spiraling into the air. The fire died instantly, leaving behind only a scorched, empty space. Daniel's chest heaved. It was over. Or so he thought. Then from the darkness, a single page fluttered down. It landed at his feet, untouched by the fire. Ink bled onto it, forming new words. Daniel's breath caught in his throat as he read the first sentence. Daniel Carter thought he had burned the book. But curses are not so easily destroyed. A deep, sinking horror clawed through his stomach. Then below it, one final line. The book was gone, but the story lived on. Daniel didn't sleep that night. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring at the single remaining page resting on his nightstand. No matter how many times he tried to rip it, burn it, or flush it down the drain, it always came back. The words on it changed every few hours, but the message was always the same. The story lives on. Daniel knew he was cursed. The book wasn't just an object. It was a parasite. It didn't die when he burned it. It only changed form. And it needed a new host. A terrible thought crept into his mind. If he couldn't destroy it, maybe he could get rid of it another way. His hands trembled as he picked up the page and folded it neatly. He stuffed it inside an envelope, scribbled an unfamiliar name and address he found online, and headed to the nearest mailbox. Let someone else have it. As the envelope disappeared into the slot, a chill ran down his spine. The weight of the page was gone from his hands, but had he truly freed himself? He turned to leave. That was when he heard it. A soft, familiar whisper. "The story isn't over, Daniel." He froze. The whisper wasn't coming from the mailbox. It was coming from inside him. Panic surged through him. He clawed at his chest, as if he could rip the voice out. The book had never needed a physical form. It had already written him into its pages. His breath hitched as new words burned into his mind, words that weren't written on any page, but inside him. Daniel Carter's story was not one of escape. It was one of replacement. Daniel staggered back, his vision blurring. Somewhere, far away, the envelope was being opened. A young girl named Emma found the neatly folded page inside. Curious, she read the words aloud. "The book that writes your fears." She frowned. Strange. She didn't remember ordering anything like this. Then, beneath the title, ink slithered into a new sentence, one written just for her. Emma never should have read these words. Her heartbeat quickened. The ink began to move. Across town, Daniel collapsed to his knees, his body growing hollow. His fingers faded into ink, his skin turning to words, his voice dissolving into whispers. The book had a new owner. And Daniel? Daniel was nothing more than another story, waiting to be told. The end.